Well, g'day everyone, and welcome to the video and audio version of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. I'm coming live from my son's bedroom. I don't know about you, Brian. Where are you coming from?
I'm not coming live from your son's bedroom because that would be really, really weird. But I am coming live from my home office where I always record. Fairly boring, as people can see in the background. Not a great deal happening in here, but it is my space. I like it.
It's very beige, your background. I'm thinking that as we
Yes.
grow into this whole YouTube thing, we'll soon have the forward-facing lights and the neon in the background, like those influencers tend to do. I mean, we probably won't, but it'll be a sign that we've moved into the video age.
Yes, once I get rid of my beige. So it is a very beige palette, this room, as we can see the curtains and the walls. So
Yes, because YouTube
yes.
killed the podcast star. That would be a song we could do, yeah?
Yes, it did. It did. But, hey, we are getting a few people watching us on YouTube, which is lovely. And a few people flipping on, but it'd be great to have a few more. And don't forget, people, to hit that subscribe button because that is very, very helpful in us being able to get more people. It helps the algorithms, but also helps us to potentially get someone to advertise on the pod as well, which always helps with paying the bills.
Yep, and it always drives numbers as well, and being ex-Pentecostals, it's all about numbers, Brian. It's all about numbers.
Absolutely. Soul saved,
It
brother.
is.
Soul saved. So,
Exactly right. Hey, so we are on video and there's someone sitting in the shot here who we need to introduce, so I'll throw that to you, Uncle Brian.
oh, thank you, Troy. I love it when you call me uncle. Hey, when actually, as a little bit of a side thing here, I took my niece to a Red Hot Chili Peppers gig. I reckon it was 10 years ago. And she was looking around for me, and she was like 30 at the time. She's like, Uncle Brian, Uncle Brian. Then all the crowd around us started going, Uncle Brian, Uncle Brian. And then it started to sort of spread out a bit. And I had all these people yelling, Uncle Brian, throughout the mosh pit. It was great. It was great fun.
Yeah, well, that's what my
Um,
kids call you. That's why I call you Uncle Brian.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's lovely. I like it. Hey, we've got a guest today who has been on podcast a couple of times, and we were just chatting that it seems like once every 2 years. So Josie McSkimming was on first with us, episode number 25 back in September 2021. So in the early days, and then Josie did a Patreon special pretty much 2 years ago, and now here we are, 2025. Josie's on again. So, Josie, you are the first person that we've had on 3 separate times. So, congratulations. But I
Thanks.
do want to introduce what you're here about to talk about today, and then we'll do a bit of a check in with you. So, Josie has written another book. So, her book is called Gutsy Girls, Love, Poetry and Sisterhood. And it's a memoir that really jumps into that a complex family life. And who would have guessed, as ex fundies, that we would have complex family lives? And that's really around her relationship with her sister, who was a renowned Australian poet, Dorothy Porter. Um, Josie published the book this year, and it really jumps into some of that stuff that we often talk about on the pod, but this will really personalize some of that story. So the title Gutsy Girls, though, it's inspired by a song from The Fiery Maze, which is a rock opera that Dorothy co-created with musician Tim Finn from Split Enz fame, and then he went on to his solo career. So that's a bit of a name drop here in Australia. So even though they're Kiwis, we claim them as Australians. Now, growing up on Sydney's northern beaches under the shadow of their volatile father, and we're going to get into this a bit with Josie. He was a barrister, Chester Porter, and Dorothy and Josie, they had a bit of a challenging family environment, which we are going to unpack a little bit more. And we're going to talk about those intersections, I guess, with fundamentalism and normal family dynamics. I'm really looking forward to talking about this, Josie, because people's stories are things we connect with. This is
Yeah.
a sort of a story which sits beside you, but you are part of. But welcome, Josie McSkimming, to I Was
Thank
a Teenage
you.
Fundament thrice times.
Thrice.
Yeah.
Yeah, lucky me.
Yes. How good. Hey, Josie, what have you been up to?
What have I been up to? Well, I suppose I should start by kind of, talking about the environment, seeing that's what we're all doing. I've tried to compensate the kind of the rather drabness of the room with some grevilleas and the wine fridge in the background. If you're wondering what that was, because people do, I thought I might as well just get it all out there. It's a very big one.
Did the wine fridge used to hold water and then your Jewish friend came over for the wedding?
Oh, God.
No, okay.
Oh, my God, how did you know? No.
Yeah, and
Anyway,
it's the best
so that's
stuff
the
now, right?
background.
It's the best stuff.
So what have I been up to? Well, as you guys know, I do a lot of counselling and with people who have left evangelical fundamentalist churches, cults. And so I've certainly been doing that, but I have finally got the book out. It came out in February, and that's been a very onerous and stressful process, I must say, because the writing of the book is its own challenge. And then there's the launch of the book and the spruiking of the book and the interviews that you are required to participate in. So I've been doing a lot of that, trying to enjoy it. Yep.
How long was the writing process for you, Josie?
Well, I started it in 2018, all the research, but it was accepted for publication a year before it came out. So there was a lot of editing even prior to the publication. So the writing of it takes a long time, but the editing and the refining of it seems to take forever. I mean, there must be 40 drafts I've written of this book. So for anybody who's interested in writing a book, there are many iterations. You have to kind of go through that process and maintain your momentum.
That sounds tough. But hey, to write a book like this, you've got to have credentials, and we need to check in on some of those credentials first. And one of them, Josie, before we start, were you a teenage fundamentalist?
Oh, was I ever? I started at 10, so I'm a pre-teenage fundamentalist. Hey.
Wow. You're a tweenage fundamentalist.
I was a tweenage. Oh, that's so good. Yeah, I was a tweenage fundamentalist. And
yeah, that is good. But if you do take that and start a podcast, we will sue you. Okay, just putting that out there.
There's no danger. Well, I did say this at a kind of a talk I did at Balmain Library. And then I said, and then I was in the church till I was 35, and there were audible gasps. I think they thought I was going to say, yeah, and then I gave it up after 5 minutes or 2 years. And when you say you were in it for all this time from 10 to 35, people are startled that you didn't come to your senses earlier. But of course, we all know that it is hard to unpack, and we don't do it fast. And I wish I had left earlier, but anyway, that's how it is. Oh, what did I just say? 35, 45. Oh, sorry.
35 years.
Sorry, I didn't really properly exit till I was 45.
Maybe they gave a gasp because you're really good at writing but shit at maths. Maybe that's what it was. They were just like,
I said I was in it for 30 years. Yeah, maybe that was it.
That's what happens when you work in primary education, which I used to. If you're that bad at maths, people will gasp and audibly. Hey, before we jump into talking about the book, though, can we explore the context, particularly to what extent the book seeks to balance your personal story with the biography of your sister Dorothy?
Well, look, it was a very difficult process, and there are lots of people who are experts in the field of memoir and biography who may have particular views on this, but I started writing it as a straight biography because that's what I wanted to do. And it just became very apparent that I'm not a literary biographer. When you're writing a biography, it's a particular skill, it's a particular way of writing, and it was much more interesting when I reflected and I was reading all of her letters to me and all of her works that a memoir was far more appropriate. And so I realised that I had to write about our relationship and how that had emerged from the family and how and why I'd actually got involved in the church and she hadn't, and my other sister Mary hadn't either. And then, of course, how I exited. And I'd realised actually many years earlier how crucial she was in my exit. And I even said this in my first book, the Leaving Christian Fundamentalism book, how instrumental she was. But this book allowed me to really pull that apart, dissect that. And so the biography morphed into a memoir. And I think that was actually a good decision and far more interesting to people.
Speaking of family dynamics, something that stuck out to me was in Brian's intro where he, and I did read this before, and that's when it stuck out to me, but when he spoke about your father being volatile. And that really struck me. I was like, oh, Josie, that's something that I have actually been pondering recently about my own father's volatility.
Right.
Before we jump into the story about Dorothy, how did that set a context for not just your relationship with your sister, but your whole dive into fundamentalism?
Well, because, I do a lot of psychotherapy, I've been thinking about childhood trauma for many, many years. And of course, it's very relevant to think about your own childhood trauma. And you're always processing that as a therapist so it doesn't interfere with the work. Because when people come to you, the containment is around their story and their process. And so you actually have to manage your own triggering or reverberations around this. So it's not obviously the first time I've been thinking about this, but my father was a very complicated person and grew up with a very disengaged, emotionally cold and cruel mother, I think it's fair to say. And he was extremely successful in his work as a lawyer, and he was regarded very highly in the legal community. And but what a lot of people didn't know, and this is, I think, it's interesting in the introduction talking about trauma childhoods perhaps being relevant to the entry into churches. And he was very volatile. And I really balk at using words like, as some people have said to me, narcissistic bully and this sort of thing. I don't like too much labeling and diagnoses of people's behaviour. I like to sort of describe it in a more expansive way than that, because he was a very complicated person, but he was terrifying at times. And his rages were terrifying. And I was the youngest of three, so I was probably the most scared, I think, when some of these rages were at their zenith. And, there were times when I feared for my safety and the safety of my mother and my sisters. So, it wasn't all the time every day. And I think the thing is that, like lots of people who've grown up with this kind of situation, is, the fact is that you kind of wonder if it will come, even if it isn't every day, even if it's every 3 months. You wonder about, the possible eruption of the storm, and you can feel the storm clouds gathering, and you actually know when something is about to happen because you can feel the change in the temperature. So you get very, very good at that radar about measuring what's going on. This is why I think a lot of us ends up as therapists who've grown up in these families, because we have these very developed radars of figuring out what's going on. But even if it wasn't every day or every week, when some of these most tempestuous times happened, it was truly terrifying. And I think the thing was that from an early time, I started to wonder about my place in the family. I started to, become rather disengaged from school. I was starting to misbehave when I was in primary school. I was trying to get attention. I was 4 years younger than one sister, 6 years younger than the other. I felt they were successful. I felt I wasn't. It was sort of complicated when you're a kid. So, of course, off you go to a Christian camp, which was my first encounter with evangelicalism. And off I went to this Christian camp, Camp Howard. People remember Camp Howard. And that's now Youth Works, isn't it? Anglican Youth Department. And I was converted because it seemed to me that this was the thing to do, and this would offer me meaning and safety and security and purpose in my life in a family that was with a father that was volatile and a situation that felt uncertain. And maybe it wasn't uncertain, maybe it was very certain, but, this is how I felt when I was a kid. So I do think that my father's, my father's behaviour in the family did affect that decision.
It's interesting because I'm sitting here going, oh, look, Brian, she's telling my story. But I'm sure there's a lot of people that are listening that are thinking that you're telling their story as well.
Yeah.
It's very common, I think, for sure. But let's jump into the book, right? I mean, not that we haven't, but tell us about Dorothy. Who was she both as a person that others saw and the person that you knew? And was this the same person or was it far more complex?
Well, of course, it's always far more complex. There'll be people listening who may have somebody in their life that is a public figure. And it is really quite a strange phenomenon to have somebody close to you who is a public figure, because how they are represented in their public life is not how they are privately. And she was what I've described as a unicorn in Australia's literary landscape, in that she was a poet and a writer who was a bestseller. And I don't know if before or since, maybe apart from Banjo Paterson or Henry Lawson, there has been a poet who's been a bestseller. And she struggled, like lots of writers, to make her mark. She kept getting refused for literary grants. But from a very early time, from about the time she was 14, she said, I'm going to be a writer. And she had her first book of poetry published when she was 21. So she was quite a remarkable, precocious and prodigious talent. So she went on to publish many books, but her hit book was The Monkey's Mask, which is still in print. And it was an absolute hit. It was made into a movie with Susie Porter and Kelly McGillis, of Top Gun and Witness fame. And Kelly McGillis and Dorothy, my sister, flirted, crazily on set of The Monkey's Mask. So that's funny. But yeah, so the book was, it's a detective story in verse. It's sort of an erotic lesbian love story. Well, a story that goes wrong, but a detective story with a really interesting puzzle in it. And people loved it. It's great. It's very accessible. It's very engaging. And people like the story and people are still buying it. I mean, she's written many more books after that. But, that's her public persona. She was also a huge performer. So people loved her performances. She, she also pursued an acting career briefly, studied acting. So she was a great performer of her work. And she also taught at universities. She was a scholar. But, she was also a very passionate person with multiple love affairs, which somebody has said to me in the book, it needs just a bit more sex. So, but I deliberately tried not to be exploitative of my sister's sex life because she wouldn't have wanted that.
And is that also a little bit of the Anglican in you? Like it just wouldn't be proper?
Yeah, I was couldn't know. They sort of prurient details. I just couldn't do it.
I just watched you grab your pearls then, by the way. I don't know if you realised you did that. You actually did, yeah.
Today. Yeah, no, look, when you're writing about somebody you love, but also people who've died, and even my own parents, I couldn't publish this until both of them had died. When you're writing a memoir or a biography, there's a certain ethical complexity in writing about people who have died and people who are still alive. And I had to navigate that terrain, and that's been not easy. But I kept thinking about, when I was writing about her, whether this reflected her accurately. Because privately, she was our protector when we were kids, my sister Mary and I. She was the eldest, and she was the one who stood up to my father and tried to protect my mother, even probably all her life. So when my father would want to drive the car home and he'd had too much to drink, she would be the one to take him on to say, you're not driving that car, often unsuccessfully, but she would do it, and she was very bold and felt that it was her role to protect us all with him. And I think it was costly for her. I think she paid quite a high price for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just before you spoke about that, Josie, I was thinking, what role did Dorothy play in the family? Because
Yes.
everyone plays a
Yes.
role, particularly with that volatility. So it's
Yes.
interesting you say that. But when she did take on that role of protector, which, you know, being an older sister, I think it's a bit of a natural thing quite often.
Sure.
What did that do in terms of your relationship with her? Because you're also trying to skate that thin line of complexity as well in wanting the love of your parents, also wanting
Yes.
a connection with your sibling. What did it do for your relationship?
Well, I felt very grateful to her and very dependent upon her, certainly as a kid. And was also very worried for her in some of these fights because she was very, um, yeah, she was brave and she was only little like me. We're only 5'1", and she was really, what's that boxing term? Facing up to my father, ready to take him on in a physical way. And so I was scared. So, but also, grateful for all of that. Um, But as we got older, it was quite interesting because I then withdrew from the family because I didn't feel as connected as perhaps I wanted to be. And of course, the church, like lots of people in our situation, provided such an alternative family, if you like. And I went to a terribly fun youth fellowship on the northern beaches, which was, lots of singing, lots of flirting, lots of hanging around, Sunday night suppers, smoking, because we all smoked. Um, Look, it was just such a great, there was religion, but it wasn't too high powered. It became much more high powered for me when I went to university. And so I was sort of had that outsider status. And meanwhile, my sister was discovering that she was queer. And, people didn't come out as queer as easily as they do now. And she started living with a woman, but we thought it was her flatmate. And so they were in an open relationship. So she was living that life. And funnily enough, we found ourselves able to really talk to each other with this kind of strange outsider status, which was very different. But there's nothing like shared grievances to bring people together. And we used to talk incessantly about my father and the family dynamics. Would just power us up. And whenever there was some incident, when I was older, whenever there was, an incident when I was a young adult or even older, she's the first person I'd ring. I'd just get her on the phone and say, he's done this, I can't bear it. And she would do the same for me.
So you obviously had a kinship, you had a camaraderie, you had this, dare I say, connection around the trauma. But how do you think remembering who we are, Josie, I was a teenage fundamentalist, so a lot of these questions are going to be about the impact of
Oh,
the religion and the
absolutely.
intersection, right? So how did you think your religious beliefs at the time affected your sister in spite of all this, everything that you just said?
Oh, well, we had a very bad time, particularly, I would say, during my 30s. Um, Sort of during my 30s, I had 3 children. I was very immersed in probably the most rigid church of my life. And I was involved in, particularly repressive practices, both in belief and in my own practice. So I was promoting women as subordinate to men in church. I wasn't supporting the ordination of women. I was understanding men and women's relationships as, complementarian rather than egalitarian, all these horrible things that we all embraced. But as I've argued before, I always think there was something below that didn't accord with it. There was some kind of ethical problem with all of this. And I was also involved with, a group I don't know if it's still going, called Liberty, which was about, in simple terms, pray the gay away, which was trying to deconversion practices. So I was thinking, if I could get my sister converted, and then she would give up her gay and queer identity because, that's what would happen and Jesus would change her. So that was what I was aiming for, to convert her so that she would renounce or move away or kind of, anyway, it's all absurd and embarrassing and very regretful when you discuss these things many years later. But, we can all relate. That's why we're all here talking. And she was very angry with me. And
So
she told me,
embraced this progressiveness, and you were embracing this conservatism dressed up as
right,
religion or as
yes,
religion. You're trying to convert her. Do you think she was trying to convert you or rescue you, or did
oh
she live and
yes,
let live?
oh yes, I think so. And I think I discovered this much in depth when I was writing the book, because I went through all the books that she'd given me over the years and I looked at all the inscriptions in them, and it just all came together. She was giving me books that would lure me away from this, and, amazing literature that would inspire me to think differently. And, meanwhile, she was calling me this Bible wanking Pharisee. That was good.
That is brilliant.
And sort of religious schizoid personality, and it was repressing my kind of wild and creative self. This was all in her diary. And so I didn't know all of this till I read all of her diaries. And it was it was sad, but extremely interesting and maybe validating too, that she could see that I was burying something very important about myself. But no, she was very angry. And then she had an affair with a married man, and I came and had a nice little talk with her about morals and ethics and appropriate behaviour. And then she just wanted to knock me over, I think. So, yeah, I must have been an impossibly sanctimonious little sister for a time. So there you go. Nothing like the sanctimony of a fundamentalist.
It's great, isn't it? It's such a
It's
so
just,
good to be on the right side of
yes,
history, isn't
well,
it? Yes.
but and then I was helping my son, because my sister was always very superstitious, and she was always interested in gods and goddesses and pantheism and and paganism. She was kind of interested in very alternative views, and I was actually even talking to my son about how we had to pray for his auntie because she was worshipping the goddess Ashtoreth, the Egyptian goddess, and she was sort of going to hell and all of this. I don't quite know how she found out about this, but she wrote the meanest poem about me and how appalling this may well have been. And that poem, which is previously unpublished, of course, is in the book. So some people have said that I'm just a little bit too hard on myself in the book, in the middle section. But, I think I deserve to be a bit hard on myself. And sometimes I think it's okay for us to be hard on that old fundamentalist self. When we've got a bit of space, I've also got self-forgiveness. I've also got a deep understanding of what was going on. But I'm okay about saying what I did back then was very wrong and very hurtful and very harmful.
I mean, what you've described over the last couple of minutes really could be observed as coping mechanisms from both of you in response to the lives that you lived. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe I'm just putting value-laden judgments on there.
Well,
But
it's not as simple as night follows day and A plus B. We're all very complicated people, and a lot of us have complicated childhoods, and we make lots of different decisions along the way. But there's no doubt about it that kind of being marinated in a traumatic or a unstable household does leave its residue. I mean, it does. But I'm certainly not of the belief that things are predictive, or because I don't like it when people are very essentialist. Oh, this happened to you, so it removes the agency that we have about choices we make in our lives. Yeah,
I
but
agree.
yeah, I take your point, but with some softening of it.
Well, yeah, I don't like to soften the blows sometimes, Josie. That's okay. It's the way I roll. Um, I'm really interested for us to dig in a bit more about Dorothy, and obviously we will be talking a lot more around your relationship that's what the book's about.
Yeah.
It's talking about that. But I think the book really highlights and digs into Dorothy's poetry as a creative outlet, but also a form of resistance against whatever it may be. And I really would love you to speak more to that, because resistance can come in so many different forms and shapes. But talk us through how you think Dorothy directed her resistance, and whether it was a response into your upbringing in your family life.
Well, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? And I don't know if she would understand it that way. Um, we can observe, but she was, as I said, she was kind of quite superstitious, and she thought she was given a muse, and she wondered all her life whether that muse would be taken from her. She thought that she'd been given a gift from the gods to write. And she had this story that she used to tell, which was entirely made up. God knows why she was telling it, that she used to be a savant with jigsaw puzzles. So when she was little, anybody could throw some 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle in front of her and she'd put it together. And my mother said it was just completely untrue and she could never do a jigsaw puzzle, ever. So, and then she said one day that gift was taken from her. She couldn't do a jigsaw puzzle. So this was some kind of metaphor about her fear of losing her creative genius. And it was a fear for her. And so she used to fuel it all the time with passion. So her passionate relationships with her lovers fueled her work. And she believed if she didn't have these passionate experiences, she wouldn't be able to write. Now, towards the end of her life, that was very much changed and revised. But basically, all of her life, even from a small child, she had obsessive crushes on people. Now, whether this is her way of using her imagination and her passion to escape the rigors and the horrors of our childhood, yes, at least in part. But then I wonder, if we'd had a different childhood, would she have still been like this? I mean, some people are born with an extraordinary gift to write. They're very creative. So she went into her imagination. She went into her creative vision. She wrote all her books. And I, was into Jesus.
But
I think she got the better part, as it were.
But Brian was just asking then about the resistance. And one thing that strikes me is you're now writing as a form of resistance.
Oh,
This is
yes.
exactly what you're doing.
Well, it's easier for me to reflect on me. I mean, Dorothy used to also go to these Christian camps, but she fell in love with the women. She didn't fall in love with, our Lord and Savior. And it was a great protective thing. I mean, she suffered a lot in love because she was in love with a lot of the leaders. But, I found God. And yes, I think I started my resistance in earnest after she died. I kind of look at what I wrote at her funeral, and it was like the beginning of something really lit up inside me. And that's when I started writing academic articles about kind of sharing a parallel process with your clients, because I was seeing a lot of clients who had doubts about the church, as did I. I'd left, but I still, even after you leave the church, we still have these remnants of belief for some years and working throughs. And that's when I started my whole process. And I certainly see my writing as resistance, protest, refusal to accept this kind of pastoral control that I've had all my life. Yeah, and, as I've said before, I'll speak up because others are scared to speak up. They're not ready to speak up. So I'm happy to speak on behalf of others. I'm happy to take the fall.
Sounds like Dorothy inspired you to do that. Like you're saying, you
I
really
think
took
she
up that
did.
mantle.
I
Yeah.
think she did. And she just wouldn't tolerate fakes. And in The Monkey's Mask, the most vile characters are the hypocritical Christians. It's very confronting. So I encourage people to go and read that because it's kind of, you have your head in your hands. They're dreadful people. And I wondered at the time whether she saw me like this. Hopefully she didn't, but maybe she did a bit. But yeah, I think she did inspire me by the books she gave me, by the things she wrote, by the fact that I kind of have realized that there is another way to live. You can live in your imagination. You can live a progressive life. You can actually make friends without looking towards their eternal destination. You're not responsible for converting people. I mean, the whole way she lived her life was an antithesis of mine. And so that certainly cracks something open for you to see that you can do life differently. And I think after she died, when I absolutely knew there is no hell, that's kind of galvanized me. Because there'll be people listening to this who've had people they love, absolutely love, who've died, and they haven't been believers. And you just know that you've been conned, that something terrible has happened to you, thinking that these people are facing some kind of medieval torture punishment. Like your very good episode on hell, which I did enjoy. So certainly she did inspire my process. But I think I had to write the first book before I wrote this book, because I had to really get clear about how do you reconstruct your identity? How do I understand that? And how do other people do it too?
Families are complex. Geez, and all the way through this
Sure.
episode, I'm thinking about my relationship with my family, particularly those who are still in. And I've had conversations with one of my sisters in particular who never bought into it. We're all converted later in life, and she never did. And she and her have had some conversations. She and I, sorry, have had some conversations where she said to me, "Yeah, I didn't know what the fuck you were on about. Like, I had no idea. Why is Brian involved in this? This isn't him." And she didn't quite understand how it could actually be dragged into that. And, I think about the regrets I've often got about how I engaged with family and with friends. But I think, you live and learn. You did it, and you can use it for the powers of good when you come out the other side, and forms of resistance like you
Yeah.
are, which I
Yeah.
think is a
Like
fantastic
we all
thing.
are.
That's it.
But isn't it interesting how in some families there are those that kind of hook, line and sinker they're in? I mean, I've always been a bit kind of all or nothing. So, there I was in. And once I was in, I was in. And your sister was never in. My sister was never in. Although I do think it's easier deconverting, if you like, when your family's not all still in. And this is certainly my experience with my clients. Those whose parents and sisters and brothers are all still, totally immersed in the church, and they are the only one out, they find it much more difficult. I mean, I don't think my parents quite realised what was going on until they were at my book launch for my first book. And they said, "Oh, is this what happened to you in church?" I said, "Yep." I'd never really told them until that. And they were relieved. You can imagine.
Not at all.
Relieved.
It's good of them to have noticed, even though it went on for 35 or 45 years.
Yeah.
Josie, it's interesting listening to this because just recently in one of our episodes, we reflected on our conversions. And, after doing the pod for, this many years, coming up to half a decade, which is funny. But thinking about how we had our families that were out and the impact of people that were raised in there. And you hear this, I know this may sound a bit extreme, but you hear this sort of pre-cult personality type talk and post-cult or within cult. I think we that leave and whose families were never in it, we have something to go back to.
Yes.
We have security to step back to. Whereas, for the folks that were raised in there, there's a greater identity work, I think, to be done there.
So. I think it's very stressful and it's very tricky. And of course, the added thing for lots of people is that their spouse might still be involved and they're not. So the stakes are very high. And I think it is very worth people acknowledging to themselves and us acknowledging to them the difficulties of that and navigating that terrain, because they are actually trying to find their own ethical journey and their own ethical process through this while respecting and loving their families. And look, and as you know, there's some people who fall out with their families terribly, particularly if you're queer. And so that just adds an extra dimension. So, for the queer community with these very sort of fundamentalist backgrounds, parents, sisters, brothers, it's risky. It's risky. And we need to support people in this. We really need to support people because they're at risk emotionally and actually because it's very stressful. And, of course, all that residual longing to be back, because, it's easier to be back. There's often that residual longing to get back into that community, the horrors notwithstanding, because it's safe and it's what you know, and there's the familiarity and there's all that investment and you're kind of not wanting to lose that. So it's really hard, really hard.
It's that one-stop shop that we've often spoken about. You can actually go and fit straight into it. So I do see people getting drawn back into it even after a significant time out. And I understand why, particularly if people have had a traumatic event in their life or they've lost a loved one and they go, I'm going to go back to that place of safety. I do want to ask you a question about, I'm sure this wouldn't have been easy, but you read through some of Dorothy's letters to you, but also her personal diary entries. Like that would have been, I'd imagine, very enlightening, but also really confronting. And how did you do that for a start? But was there anything in particular, thematically, but also specifically, that jumped out and surprised you?
Well, look, she kept a diary from when she was 14 till the year she died. She died at 54. Daily, sometimes twice daily. And it's all in these notebooks, and some are kept in library in Canberra, and some she had in her possession, and nobody had read them all. Nobody had read them all. And so I embarked on that journey. Nobody still has read them all from beginning to end. I really liked the early ones because that's all about us as teens and what was going on at home, and I found them enlightening and kind of took the veil away from my eyes and also reinforced for me, yes, my experience is not exaggerated or made up. We had some terrible times. But yes, I suppose what jumped out for me was particularly when she would comment on my fanaticism as a Christian. I found that deeply upsetting. Of course I did. And, her regret. But, I also found it sort of so heartwarming because she at one point said, even though Josie seems to be, or Brat as she called me, I was always Brat in her diaries, even though Brat is so different to me, we seem to be very close and able to talk about anything. So, that's very reassuring. It's also very confronting to read your sister's diary. Somebody as passionate as her, I think she has recorded every sexual event in her diary. Every one. And that's why I didn't want to be explicit in the book. This fueled her work. Look, and I think it helped too that I'm a therapist. I'm used to people telling very private, intimate details of their life, and to be respectful and discreet in how I deal with that. I don't want to kind of be exploitative or embarrass people. So that certainly did jump out at me. I remember going, because I called her Dot, I'd read it and go, Dot, do you really need to write this down? So it's there.
Josie, when you were saying a moment ago about looking at the way she spoke about you from a religious perspective, Josie now though, did you look at that with regret, or did you look at that as going, oh, you knew, you can see, I get it too now?
Oh, yeah. Well, both. I mean, regret, but also relief. But of course, the thing is that when somebody dies and you undergo significant changes as a result of that relationship, because I think this is the heart of grieving, coming to terms with how you were changed as a result of being loved in a particular way by someone. It's kind of processing that. I mean, imagine the conversations we could have now, if only. And she could actually, I think, quite, with a great deal of intellectual skewering, figure out what was going on. She might be able to say to me, okay, Brad, let's figure this out. Why did you do this? And, you know, because by the time she died, I hadn't processed all of this, obviously. I mean, it's taken me a long time. So I feel very sad that we can't talk about it, because I think she'd find it really interesting. And, well, I'd find it interesting and I'd appreciate her insights. I mean, that's what I missed in a fairly catastrophic way after she died, her insights into the family, into our lives. Plus, I felt I'd lost my confidant, my protector. I mean, there were many roles that she filled that I felt I'd lost.
Yeah.
Where's your other sister in all this?
Well, my other sister, and this is kind of the complexity of writing a book like this. She has found the book sort of confronting in parts, because there were aspects to our relationship that I explain in this book that she wasn't really fully aware of. So since I've written this book, Mary and I have had many discussions about what used to happen in the family, because her relationship with my parents was very different. And she was really quite protected by them because of an early incident in our lives. She had an accident very early on, and they were very protective of her. So they were very focused on her and infantilized her. So that contributed, I think, to my outsider status. And she's become more fully aware of that. And so the book has not been easy for her, but to her enormous credit, she is extremely loving, loyal, and supportive through this whole process. And we're closer now. It's just sort of testament to the fact that you can talk about difficult things. A lot of people think you can't talk about difficult things, but we sure did. And also navigating my parents', decline, aging, and death. Mary and I had to do that. And so we had to come together. And anybody who is alienated from their siblings and their parents haven't died, believe me, you will have to go on that journey, because the management of your parents aging and dying does require a level of cooperation with your siblings. So
Certainly does.
we've worked it all through and we're very close. So I'm extremely relieved.
Look, I think you've really been talking about this, but it's that emotional complexity, and not just of your relationship with Dorothy, but also with Mary, as you've just spoken about.
Yeah.
And, you've all, by the sound of it, taken relatively different paths in life, regardless, and some of that's about your personality, it's about your upbringing. There's so many different factors, as we know. But talk us through that. How did you do that while you're writing the book? How did you deal with this complexity? And I don't know if you thought this, but if I was writing something like this, I'd be going, oh, how is so-and-so going to read this? How is so-and-so going to respond to this?
That's so true.
How did you deal with that, and how did you navigate it?
Well, I thought I've got to write as though I don't care about what anybody thinks, because you cannot write thinking, oh, Mum's going to hate this. No, you can't. And both of my parents were alive when I started, and they thought I was writing a straight bio. So I just had to write it. You cannot censor yourself like this, or you will just write some vanilla tale that nobody wants to read. And so my first early drafts were kind of, they were extremely emotional. And one of my sons said to me, "Oh my God, you're going to have to tone this down about your father. It's very tedious." Because it was like a rant about how horrible he was. And of course, the longer he's been dead and the more I thought about it, it was a much more nuanced story about our relationship. So my kids helped me a bit, and my daughter, who calls a spade a bloody shovel, would tell me that is so boring, you have to not write that. So, I had that, but, I wrote about 180,000 words to start with. You just have to write, and you can't censor it. And then you have to start really thinking through what you want to say, and then you have to talk to the people who are really affected about what you are saying. And that's when I reached the decision I had to wait until my parents were dead, because I just didn't think that I could ever navigate this with them. And my mother knew, and in the last year of her life, we had some very, very moving conversations where she apologised for some of the stuff that happened as kids and her inability to protect us from some stuff. And I completely understand where she was coming from. She knew I was writing it, but she said to me, "Should I read it?" And I said, "You won't like some of the things I'm saying." And she said, "I know, but should I read it?" Anyway, she died before she read it, and I'm kind of glad of that. But she knew that it wasn't some, happy little Vegemite tale. She knew that it was kind of strong. And she said, "I know, you have to write what you have to write." My mother was a remarkable woman. She knew what it was, but she didn't want to know. That's fine.
Yeah,
So
that's very much a boomer way of coping with a lot of things, isn't it? They just don't want to know.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't a boomer. She was a war baby. But anyway, actually, no. My mother was born in 1925. So she was a depression baby.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Josie, you've touched, obviously, well, more than touched. You've talked about your parents, you've talked about your relationships with your sisters, and you touched briefly on your own children. So talk us through how the memoir explores family trauma to the intergenerational dynamics, right?
Well, look, it's interesting. And like lots of people who've been through this, you want to deliberately do things differently. And the first thing I did, and I did this quite consciously, thank Goddess or whoever is out there, I chose a partner who was not in the least bit violent. And I was very young, that getting married young thing. So I was married at 22, but I married somebody who was completely the opposite of my father. I did it deliberately. And I knew that my children would never be scared of him. I knew that he was very safe, he was very secure. He was a bit different. He was a new convert. So, he wasn't dyed in the wool. He'd kind of had a bit of a wild life before conversion. So I thought that was good. I kind of knew this. And so that was the first good decision to break into generational trauma. And, we deconstructed at different rates, but we both did and, still together. Look, my kids all stopped going to youth groups and whatnot when they were in their early teens. And this is paralleling my own disinterest as well as allowing them to go on their own paths. So none of them went into adulthood with, a strong Christian faith or anything like that. But, they're not as badly affected. I mean, my eldest son said to me, it really wasn't all that bad, all those years we had in church. He said it was a community. It was fine. It was fun. But, when you leave at 13 and you were never immersed, it is actually an okay memory. There's certainly I'd say they're all atheists now, existentialists. My middle son's a Marxist, so they're certainly not in in the church. So I think we broke it. I think we broke it. Although they still make jokes just to get on my nerves. If they say, "Ooh, you sound just like Chester," but they had a good relationship with their grandfather. It's very different, you see. They thought I was too tough on him. They didn't see him the same way that I did because they didn't grow up with him, and he was actually on occasion with them very difficult, but mostly reasonably benign. So again, the complexity, it's not black and white. There's not goodies and baddies in this story.
Yeah, I'm sitting here listening to this and just drawing so many parallels with my own family. And it's interesting, just recently looking at my children and thinking to myself, you're not going to keep them from trauma and these other things, because just everybody's got something, right? Everybody. And it's just the joke that I say to my kids, sometimes they'll say things to me about, "Oh, Dad, you blah, blah, blah." I'll say, "Oh, well, tell it to your therapist." Later on, I say to them, and we sort of laugh, because you just can't shelter them. Everybody's got something, and I think maybe it's a Christian thing, maybe it's not, but just thinking that there's somehow a perfection that we can actually attain in terms of raising our kids. And just recently, I mean, I've got adult kids myself now, one's 20, one's 18, so just adults. But just recently, Josie, where I've actually looked at them and gone, you know what, you're doing okay, and I really can't protect you anymore. You're now actually on your own. But even raising them, I really thought that I was going to keep them from my own dysfunction. Nah, sorry, it's there. So yeah, tongue in cheek, but also true. I'll pay for the therapy. Off you go.
Absolutely. And no. And, we've had other traumas in our lives and enormous difficulties that I haven't written about in the book in a whole lot of detail that, my kids have had to navigate. So, yeah. And what's the legacy for all of them? I mean, I sometimes think that this is also, well, look, we're in a cultural bubble that thinks that we can control our children far more than we should. And we also, want to sometimes be concierge parents. I mean, when I was a university lecturing, that, there were parents who were wanting to intervene with their kids' university careers. They were wanting to sort of talk to the lecturer about their marks. These kids are 18. So I think that is a bit of a cultural thing that's happening. But I also think underneath that, as Christian parents, we had this rather strange, erroneous belief that, if we prayed enough about our children, if we really prayed and raised them in the Lord, and took them to Sunday school, and took them to youth group and all the rest of it, they would also be Christians and they would be saved. And, I see this in my work when kids aren't interested in their church and their parents are beside themselves because they think that was a contract. It's never promised that way, but it was an unwritten contract that somehow. So I think some of us old fundies think that we can kind of just control our children. Maybe it's an old legacy by prayer and entrusting them to God. And I certainly did used to think that. And I used to think the worst possible thing was if your children would grow up and say, "I'm not interested in being a Christian." That would be the worst possible thing.
As Penties, Josie, we had that verse that we used to quote from the Old Testament: "Train up a child in the way that it should go, and when it's old, it will not depart from it."
Yes,
so that was a promise. That was a promise.
That's
So
a promise.
that it was more than unspoken. It was a promise. I had a friend of mine recently who said to me, he's still involved in church, and he said to me that he stopped seeing parental success being dependent on whether their children were saved or not.
Well, that's a huge departure for him. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, and certainly a lot of my clients, young people, they experience that firsthand, their parents' enormous disappointment and sense of failure, that they are now saying to their parents, "We're not interested in what you believe in." And for these parents to still have a functional relationship with their children, who were non-believers seems to be a very high kind of mountain to climb. Beautiful young people. I'd be proud if they were my kids, but a lot of the very kind of strict parents just can't come at it because they're apostates.
Filthy
Yeah,
apostates.
I'm relieved that my kids aren't involved in it. I'm relieved.
Oh, so
Of
am I,
course.
yes.
Yeah, for sure. Filthy apostates, as Brian just said then under
Filthy
his breath.
apostates.
We'll have to leave
Filthy
that in. I
apostates.
heard that. That was a good one.
Unbelievable. Hey, Josie, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners actually reflecting on, Josie's been able to successfully, to a large degree anyway, I think, break or at least disrupt that intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
But you've made some very intentional steps towards that, I think.
Yes.
But do you think that that's something that everybody has the privilege of or the ability to do? Or do you think that your training, particularly in psychotherapy and that ability to self-reflect more, dive deeper, it's something that you're actually trained in? Do you think that that has been, I think, the special sauce in you being able to do that?
It all helps. It all helps, but there's a bit of luck in it too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some people married the wrong person because their minister told them to marry them, or they thought they should when they had nothing in common. And they had to go through processes of separation, divorce, or maybe they still feel that they need to stay there. And for a lot of people, that's very hard. I mean, I made this intentional choice to marry this person, but I think it's a bit of luck too. I mean, we both deconstructed and we both, I think, it was a good choice all those years ago because I liked him quite apart from the Christianness. A lot of people just got married for the Christianness because Jesus will work out the rest. And of course, Jesus doesn't work out the rest and everything goes wrong. So, yeah, that was a good decision. But I do think sometimes there's a bit of luck. Maybe it did help that, I've been a social worker and I've been a sort of a mental health immersed in mental health issues for many, many years. So I think about it a lot. I also try and read a lot of books about things, about if we're talking about religious stuff, I try and read lots and lots of books about people's leaving faith. And so, you've sort of got to actively find ways of managing what has happened to you. I also had counselling. So, I mean, there's things that you can do. It's not just that you've got a magic power because, I'm a therapist. I'm also very human and do very stupid things too, and self-defeating, self-harming things like all of us, where you just kind of can't believe you've done something. So there's just been no perfectionism in my journey, I can tell you. Yeah, intentional, but a bit lucky too sometimes.
Lifted the veil, Josie. Here we were thinking that you were perfect and sinless, but no, not Josie.
Definitely not seamless, and I don't want anybody to ever think that.
Hey, Josie, I want to ask you about the writing the book. Like, forget about the religious stuff that sits outside it. What for you has been the most liberating part of that? What has been the biggest thing that you've walked away going, I am so grateful I wrote this book because?
Oh, what a question. Maybe because I never thought I could do it. Maybe it's one of those times where you do something that you never thought you could do. And I did grow up with a very successful sister. That's what the book's about. And anybody who's grown up kind of in the shadow of somebody who's very successful, you kind of wonder if you can do the things that you have always wanted to do. And I think when I was a little girl, I used to think that I could write. And maybe the fact that I walked away and I actually did write it. And I kind of persevered through the whole process of trying to find a publisher. I mean, I remember talking to you guys saying, I don't have a publisher. And anybody out there interested in publishing Josie's book and all this, I guess I'm proud of the fact that I did it, and I didn't think I could. And it's, the doggedness that you've got to sort of put into it. Yeah, but I'm also kind of glad of the whole self-exploration process of writing a memoir. You can't just have the unmediated self kind of on the page. You've got to really think about you and speak about yourself honestly and as best you can about other people. And I'm glad I could do that. I'm kind of very happy that I was able to write these stories. I wish I'd put more in because there was so much more, but the editors at my publisher said, no, cut. Yeah.
Part two will have those.
I don't know. There's so many things that you want to put in a book, but it can be very boring and people don't need. I mean, we've all read books, memoirs particularly, that have got far too much detail in them, sort of minutiae that people don't need to know. They want the story to roll along. So I'm sort of glad that I could write something that rolled along. Yeah,
I reckon you could write a rock opera and write it with Neil Finn set him against Tim Finn. So
to be better than my sister. No.
Yeah, and better than his brother. So
and
perfect.
Better than his brother. Yeah.
So yeah.
You can still listen to all those songs on Spotify. I should say that. So you can go and have a listen to all those songs that the Fiery made. And they're pretty good too. But yeah, no, look, I can't go into that world of the sort of the creative, what would I say? Just the way, that creativity. I just don't have it in the same way that my sister does. So I've accepted all that too. I mean, geez, you have to reach some self-acceptance by my age.
And there's no money in it either. Do you know what I mean?
Like
there's no money in books. There's no money in podcasting. There's no money in any of it. If you think you're going to make money out of this, guess again.
Even if you have a relatively successful book in Australia, you can't live on it. You have to have like a book that sells, 20, 30,000 copies. That doesn't happen in Australia. That doesn't happen, except if you're Leanne Moriarty or, Trent Dalton, one of those very, very few novelists that people buy their books. So I don't like either of those authors anyway. Sorry. But
yeah, it's interesting because when we were doing, coming to this idea of the podcast, I was listening to, it was actually a Christian author who had deconstructed, and he actually gave the advice. He said, if you want to do something creative, put away the idea that you're going to make any money out of it. He really said this. And he said, and just do it for the sake of it. And that's what we did with the pod. And I'm really glad because it's very enriching, the experience of it. But there's no money in it. I mean, really, if you want to make money, you need to become a Hillsong pastor, I think. Well, maybe not that anymore, but one of them. Yeah. That's where the real money is.
Or become some kind of merchant banker or something that flips rubber bands at people all day but doesn't do any work. I don't know. Or inherit money. Millions of dollars.
Yes.
But no, I haven't quit my day job. And, not that there's, I'm not in a money-making career. When I chose to study social work all those years ago, it was never, ever, ever going to be a money spinner. And I don't regret it for a microsecond. It was the best decision. I'm so glad I did it. So as I say, I think I was a bit lucky in some of these decisions. Maybe I just had some sense below the surface. Don't go and do full-time ministry. Very, very good decision that I never did that. Never went to more college. Never did any of that. And don't marry a violent man. Don't marry, I should say don't marry a super-duper Christian, but yeah, he was very super-duper Christian, so much less so these days.
Well, that is certainly good advice. But have you got any other pearls of wisdom, of advice, Josie, particularly for women who are trying to make sense of their lives after leaving this really, really messy world of fundamentalism?
Women like us, Jose. Women like us.
That's right.
Girly men.
Yeah. Women of colour like us.
But What are your pearls of wisdom that you, not the pearls that you clutched before, the pearls of wisdom that you have?
For women, we often have, extensive and well-layered and sort of accretions of stories of responsibility for other people. And that's a kind of a cultural norm, but it's also, built on by the church. I went to talks when I was in my most controlling church about how women were responsible for men, that boys will be boys, but women are responsible for relationships and the emotional tenor of families. I mean, this is just a shocking burden to give to women. So I would say to women, share the responsibility around. Quit your story of over-responsibility and pleasing everybody. Try to not wait until you're 50 or 60 before you start pleasing yourself. Because, I spent a lot of time thinking about what was best for other people. It's what happens when you grow up with trauma, what's happened when you grow up in the church, what happens when you grow up as a kind of a middle-class woman in kind of capitalist societies. So, but my clients are in their 50s and 60s. They're at the fuck that stage. But I'd really like it if some of the younger women could really start to pushing back on that story that you were responsible for everything. And if somebody's upset, it's your job to fix it. Because that is a very strong cultural norm. And also the church that I was in explicitly taught it. Men were created for task, women were created for relationships. I mean, that kind of bullshit really does mess with women. So,
and also, did you remember the one? Yeah. So I got to laugh out loud, but the one about women's love is responsive. So we used to be told that it was the man's responsibility first to love her, and if she's playing up, it's because you're not loving her enough. Because a woman's love is responsive. And I remember arguing with my first wife at one time because she was doing something, and I was telling her she was pissing me off. I wouldn't have used that language. And she says, "Well, there must be something wrong with you because my love's responsive." And I was just like, okay, what do I do with this? And I knew it was bunk. And again, Josie, we had come from, not being in the church, right? This is Brian and I. And so much of this was thrown to us as new stuff. And you just knew, like you said, underneath it on some level is going, nah, this isn't real. This isn't true.
No, I know. I remember my husband at some group were saying to some co-female leader, look, I'm the leader and you're not the leader, you're the co-leader. And his heart wasn't in it. And he was saying, giving this spiel while we were running Bible study together, endless Bible studies and, meetings and responsibility for everybody's conversion. And I can see him now saying this little speech about, his headship in the group. And, thank goodness we don't have to talk like that anymore, because his heart wasn't in it. He hurt her feelings. I was embarrassed and humiliated. And it was none of us, I don't think, even believed it. But we were told to believe it, so we really tried to make it work. We were told this was God's way, so we really tried to push it and make it work. It was like this whole square peg in a round hole. It just didn't work. And as you say, you had those interactions you remember now, and they're kind of distressing. Yeah. And, when I used to try and push back on all these stories about boys will be boys and a woman's love's responsive and, if a man, oh, look, there's so much. If a man doesn't like your perfume, just put lots on so that you will, I don't know, how did this all work? So instead of saying to him, do you like my perfume or something, you'd put lots on, he'd say, I don't like that. So somehow he would still be the leader. I mean, there was all these kinds of crazy things in this book that I used to read about how to make a man feel like the leader. You would never say your own opinion. You would kind of try and show deference to his opinion. And it's manipulative, and always watched the television shows he wanted to watch. Anyway, we could go on about this for ages. But so my advice to women, just you've got to resist this stuff or you will find yourself deeply unhappy. Deeply, deeply unhappy.
It's good. See, we came straight back to the resistance theme, Josie, which I
Quite.
love, which is it's the theme of the book. It's the theme of your story, Dorothy's story, and
Yep.
I'm sure to a degree, Mary's story in many different ways. I mean, we
Well,
all have
it
resistance.
absolutely is Mary's story, and
So,
that comes out in the book too.
yeah, so it's great.
So, Josie, how do we find your book? What's the best
Oh,
way?
look,
And
it's
remembering
all-
our audience is international as well.
Well, it's all good booksellers and online. So you can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it at all the local bookshops. It's actually really easy to get. So wherever you buy your books, if you go online to buy them, you should be able to find it, even if you live in another country.
Okay.
So,
And I'll make sure that I put links to
Yeah.
to your book definitely in the show notes so people can scroll down right now
Yes.
and see that. And I'll also link to your first book.
It's a very Australian story because, it's like growing up in the northern beaches of Sydney. Maybe there's an international publisher out there.
Yes, there.
This
Oh,
is
and
but
I'm sure
yeah.
they can pick them up at Coorong and Word.
It's not a cool.
Oh,
Although
okay.
I believe my first book is in the Moore College Library,
Wow.
probably for them to kind of, stab
Critique.
with a knife. I don't know.
Yeah, it's next to all the Jehovah's Witness
Yeah,
texts.
that's right. It's
Yeah.
next door to all the people we don't want to read and the people we don't like. But yes, I don't think this is going to be in the Moore College Library. Yeah. So and if people don't know how to get hold of it or can't get hold of it, look, you could just email UQP directly. So that's the University of Queensland Press, UQP. Or, people can email me. I've got a website.
Sure that international listeners will love it because, people love Australians. There's a lot to love about us. So get on board, read about a famous Australian written by another famous Australian, Josie McSkimming.
Oh, another famous Australian. I have talked
absolutely.
to the lovely Janice Selby in Vancouver on divorcing religion. So let's hope the Canadians are reading it. Yeah.
Yes. Before they become the 51st state.
No,
Certainly. That would be great.
you should hear Janice Selby on that. But anyway,
Yes, I'm sure.
over her dead body.
And many others, I'm sure.
Quite so.
Hey, Josie, I just want to thank you for coming on today and talking about the book. We do highly recommend people get a copy, read it, but also thank you for making the time. Thank you for coming on and talking to us about what is, it's a high level of vulnerability that you write about and that you've spoken about today, and really giving people a sneak peek into your story and your history, but also more importantly, how you've dealt with it, how you've actually got to a point in your life where you're able to identify how you can successfully challenge the narrative and resist. So that is always an awesome thing. And it's something I think we're always fighting to do in our lives, regardless of whether it's religious oppression that we've been subject to or whether it's just shitty life stuff.
Yes.
And Josie, thank you for being a friend of the pod, because from our almost beginnings right through to now, you've been, and you're there in the Facebook group. You're just part of what we do. So thank you very much for being a part of this.
I'm very much a part. Although I'm not quite sure if I've clicked the subscribe button. You've just reminded me. I better go and do it.
Please do like and subscribe. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Maybe I have. I better check that. But yeah, thank you. And it's been a privilege to be part of your pod. It's good fun. Thank you. And I really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you, Josie. If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion costs of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Beck Wise. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com